I'm Rabbi Miller, and it's a delight to be invited to be leading this session of Between the Lines. We are a people of the book, and we know not only the power of the words that are written on the page, but the spaces between them as well. Our sages teach that even the white space on a Torah page has meaning and value. And with that in mind, it's revealing when one has the opportunity to speak with an author and glean the important messages that live between the lines. That seems like a very fitting image to be thinking of today as we talk to these two wonderful guests that we have. For a long time in Jewish history, we focused a lot on the rabbis as the leaders of our community. But between the lines were their families, particularly their spouses, who were supporting them, strong parts of the community, leading them and inspiring others along the way. And it's very important that we have this conversation today. In many ways, I feel almost as if I am the last one who should be leading this, because I'm another rabbi taking away from the voices of the spouses of the rabbi who are joining with us today. So my role will be mostly as moderator, asking a few questions, guiding the conversation. We're mostly here to hear from our two amazing guests, Jane Perman and Naomi Patz, contributor and co-editor respectively from the recent book, Married to the Rabbi, 60 Spouses of Retired Reform Rabbis in Their Own Words. Jane Perman is a familiar and well-known presence at Temple Shalom. A former teacher, author, education director, community leader, program consultant, conference planner, and an all-around amazing individual. Jane, I apologize if I left off any other titles. I'm sure there are many more I could have used. Jane received her BA from Barnard and her MS in education from Bank Street College. Since her arrival in Naples in 1993, Jane has been an active leader inside and outside of the Jewish community, and she is presently on the board at the Naples Senior Center at JFCS. A co-author of 3 publications, Jane wrote one of the chapters for Married to the Rabbi. She lives in Naples with her husband, our Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Jim Perman, who is joining us today as well, and she loves spending time with her 2 children and her 4 grandchildren. Joining Jane today is Naomi Patz, co-editor of Married to the Rabbi, 60 Spouses of Retired Reform Rabbis in Their Own Words. Naomi is the author of 7 books on Jewish themes, and has also co-authored a number of books, including In the Beginning, the Jewish baby record book that she wrote with Jane Perman. She was the editor/writer of the acclaimed Judaica series for the National Young Leadership Cabinet of the UJA. She has a BA in English Literature from Barnard and an MA in English from Old Dominion University, as well as an MA in Jewish Education from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, which has also awarded her an honorary doctorate. Naomi is married to Rabbi Norman Patz and has 2 daughters and 4 granddaughters. Naomi and Jane, welcome to Between the Lines.
Thank you.
All right, well, why don't we start with this, Jane? What motivated you to contribute to this collection of stories?
Well, first of all, I'd have to say there was a lot of peer pressure.
You're looking at the peer pressure.
Well, especially from Naomi, but there were others too. The book is a product of NAORR, NAORR, which is the National Association of Retired Reform Rabbis. And it's an organization of retired Reform rabbis, but also of spouses and surviving spouses. And something that's very unique to this organization, I think, is that the spouses are equal members at conferences, which we usually have annually. Spouses lead workshops, help lead services, are just regular members. They're on the, many of them are on the board. So that already puts us in a very unique position. Naomi's going to talk more about how the idea for the book originated, but there really was pressure. I think that I procrastinated for a while, but I kept getting messages to write. And I want to also put a plug in for David Rutstein, who taught a course at Temple Shalom on ethical wills. And although what I wrote and what most people wrote in this book is not an ethical will, it's I got a lot of ideas from taking David's course. And if he gives it again, I recommend it to all of you, because it got me thinking, and it made me realize that I wanted to be able to tell my story, right? These days, we're all familiar with Hamilton, where how your story is told is very important. So I thought, if I write it, then my children and my grandchildren can read it. Maybe it'll be around for my great-grandchildren, and they'll know something about their ancestors. So that's what motivated me to contribute to Married to the Rabbi.
Well, it certainly is a powerful legacy for you to have, Jane. How did Temple Shalom connect to the creation of this book?
Well, kind of unbeknownst to me, several rabbis were reached out to, many synagogues of spouses who had written essays and asked to contribute. And I want to start out by thanking Temple Shalom, Temple Shalom's One Family, Rabbi Miller, Cantor Azu, and the Shoshana Chavurah, the Chavurah that Jim and I are so glad to be part of, because they all contributed, and that helped to make the publication possible.
Well, it was our delight to be able to make this a reality and be a part of that. Naomi, if I can shift to you for a moment. Jane mentioned this before. How did the idea for Married to the Rabbi first begin?
Okay, one of my co-editor, Judy Maslin, who is the wife of Shim Maslin, a rabbi in Philadelphia, which obviously retired rabbi. All of the contributors are retired are spouses of retired rabbis, and most retired professionals in our own right. Judy had written a book called Rabbi and Judy about her own experiences, and she told this to Rabbi Dr. Gary Zola, who is the director of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. And Gary said to her, "What a great idea. There is nothing, we have virtually nothing in the archives for the period of time between, let's say, 1950 and the first decade of the 20th century, of the 21st century. And it would be great to have that." And she thought about that, and then it occurred to her that if it was good to have her book, it would be wonderful to have recollections and reminiscences and reflections by other spouses of retired Reform rabbis. And she put a flyer into one of our bulletins at the National Convention, and then something was sent out to the membership, and a few people decided, sent her something. I had the piece of paper sitting on my desk for about 6 months, maybe 8 months. Finally, I called her and said, "Is anything happening with this?" And she said, "Well," I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I have a lot of experience editing. I'll be happy to work with you on editing it. Just let's get moving on it so it can happen." And that's how I got involved. That's how it began. And indeed, the archives, the essays are at the archives. And since the publication of the book, I would say 10 or 12 additional spouses of rabbis have sent essays which we have submitted and are part of that collection.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's great to hear this is a part of history, of kind of notating what has been happening and to capture that part of American Jewish life, particularly from the 20th century. What are some of the key themes that came out as you were talking with the authors and as you had a chance as a co-editor to read through all the materials that were submitted?
Okay. I'm going to start with something slightly different, which is in terms of dinosaurs, which is what we kind of are. This was because talking and mostly I do my talking and writing. I email and text, but talking to the other spouses, we established this was the beginning of Women's Lib, the first issue of Ms. Magazine, and the uproar from that, and the unnervingness for some of us, and what eventually did emerge in terms of female rabbis Women's involvement in sisterhood and synagogue changed. Women became presidents of synagogues. Women became rabbis. Women stopped teaching Hebrew school and went back to work full time. All of these massive changes which affected us and affected the congregations, and of course affected our spouses. I say spouses. There was one male spouse of a rabbi contributed an essay, and I would like to talk about that a little bit later. But remember, these are retired rabbis, and there weren't that many women early on, enough for there to be a lot of retired rabbis. So the issues, what were the issues? The issues were, well, first of all, the big issues: Vietnam, civil rights, the Soviet Jewry movement, ambivalence about reform, about Israel in the reform movement. We came from different backgrounds. Is this okay for me to continue with this at this point?
Sure.
Okay. Some of the writers came to, how did we become, who were we to become rabbis' wives? Some came from traditional observant families. Some grew up in classical reform families. Some had Christmas trees in their childhood homes, no rituals or holidays at all. And they expressed being very lucky to have a neighbor who had a Jewish neighbor who had a more traditional background. Others themselves are children and grandchildren of rabbis, including the late Marion Dreyfus, whose grandfather was Leo Beck, a very famous rabbi who was interned in Terezin. But let me see, you asked who we were. Was that what I forgot what you asked now?
I asked some of the key themes, but it's powerful to hear from you the different backgrounds, the things that connected them as far as that time period, but also the unique stories of where they're all coming from. Were there any themes that came out from reading their materials that kind of struck you?
Both yes and no. Jane, did you want to say something? Did you want to answer that?
I'm going to say the titles of their essays.
Sure. Absolutely.
Pick a few.
Well, it's okay. I'm not going to give 60 titles, Jane. You're safe. This will give us a sense of the scope of the book through some of the chapter titles. So, and these are not the order of the titles in the book, but I put them here for development. A Rebbitzin Remembers is one. Don't Call Me Rebbitzin is another one. Dreams, Disappointments, and Fulfillment. Unanticipated Blessings and Joy. She never comes to services, and she always sits in the back. Joy and Sorrow, What is the Balance? Rabbinic Spouse Memories, The Silly Stuff. The Conversion of Miss Know-It-All. And Jane's The Blessings of a Rabbinic Spouse. That's, I don't know, that's 9 or 10 of 60. But I think it's, it gives a sense of the range. What did people talk about? Some of them talked about how they had always wanted to marry a rabbi. Some of them talked about how they discovered that the man they were dating had decided to go to rabbinical school, or that her husband, who was going to be a professor or in international relations or city planning, had just entered rabbinical school without telling her. Things, little things like that, which, clearly radically affected relationships and how people went about it. The whole business of Rebbitzin or no Rebbitzin. What did being a Rebbitzin mean to some of these people? The women who came from more traditional backgrounds had very little problem with the term, but people from more classical reform or unaffiliated backgrounds, envisioned, I guess, something out of Shtisel long before Shtisel. It was a woman with a sheitel and dressed in black and probably dumpy and heavy set, and with her stockings her low stockings rolled up by her knees, sitting with her legs apart, whatever, and being bossy. Those were pretty much the images of that group. And then there were others. There were at least 3 women who wrote in their essays that if the times were a little bit later, in other words, 10 years later, they themselves would have chosen to go to rabbinical school rather than looking to marry a rabbi. And in fact, there are numbers of writers who talked about going to college or getting jobs in Cincinnati, which is where the mother church, so to speak, of the Reform movement is, the HUCJIR, specifically so that they would meet rabbinical students. So so that's one whole range. Another range are the people who worried about how their careers, and there were people who had careers from early on, how they could manage to be congregational rabbis' wives with what were then the, what's the right word, the expectations of a rabbi's wife, and how that would meld or mesh or conflict with what they were doing. So that's, Jane, do you want to add to that?
Yeah,
Actually,
well, I'm ready for the next question.
all right. So thank you,
Okay.
Naomi, for those insights into where people were coming from and their perspectives. It's certainly a powerful reminder that it was only in 1972 that the first female rabbi was ordained and the first female cantor a few years after that. And it leaves one to wonder what other paths might have been open at different periods of time. Jane, I want to go to you and ask, from reading these stories of your fellow rabbinic spouse colleagues, what did you learn from their experiences that might have differed from your own?
Well, first of all, let me tell you a little bit about my own, and also a little bit about how I kept finding parallels with my own, but also what you're asking about, differences. So my own background, I grew up in a house that loved and valued Judaism, and that was a really good foundation for my entire life to come, including being married to Jim. My parents were they were charitable. They sent us all to my sister and my brother and I to Jewish camps. We went to youth groups. We went through Hebrew high school. So I had very, very solid Jewish background coming into this. And when I met Jim in high school, we were high school sweethearts. I discovered that he was on the same page kind of as I was. And there were a lot of spouses who wrote who either had had met their spouses early on and found that was very powerful. As Naomi has mentioned, there were others that had no context for being married to a rabbi. And people often ask me, when did Jim know he wanted to become a rabbi, and how did I feel about it? He was in college. We were both in college, and when he decided that was the direction that his interests were taking him, and he was encouraged by some professors. He can tell you that story. But so how did I feel about it? And the same as some, and different from some of the other spouses who, were not prepared. I had a frame of reference for it from growing up. And I also had all this, I had really a passion for Jewish life. And so much so that I tell in my essay, and I'm telling you here in public and out loud, that when he said he was going to be a rabbi, I imagined us singing Hebrew songs in bed when we were married. And I'm sure that was not Jim's idea. Anyway, so we never did sing Hebrew songs in bed, but you can tell I really, that's something that I embraced. When I hope sometime that some of you will be inspired to read some of the essays, because the backgrounds and the choices that all these spouses made, some were like mine. I mean, in my generation, everybody was going back to work at a certain point because of the women's movement. And I have to give credit to Betty Friedan and her book, The Feminine Mystique, which I read, I think I was still in college, but it influenced us, that whole generation of the people in the 60s. Women's Lib, which I know you know something about. Some of you were involved too. But so as Naomi said, some people had careers before that. I had always known that I wanted to be a teacher. And of course, we heard from parents, oh, teaching, it's such a great job to fall back on, because they thought, oh, okay, you're going to be a mother and a wife. But you could always, you know, if something happens, you can always go back to teaching. So some of us started out like that, but then we realized that we wanted careers of our own and we wanted more. And there are such fascinating accounts in this book of women who had fascinating careers. And some, by the way, were not married to congregational rabbis. There were a few that were Hillel chaplains, university professors. There's one spouse who became a politician on her own in Colorado. There's one who's a museum director. There were dancers and artists, and I mean, you name it. But it was both. I mean, I think to say to the younger people, we benefited from this opening up from women's lib to be able to pursue these careers. And most of us who went back to whatever our jobs were, or chose a different job when our kids were in school, and we realized that it's okay to go have a career of your own, we benefited from the shifts in society. What came out from reading these essays, and also from my own experience, was that because we were a transitional generation, we ended up doing both. We were still traditional because that was what was the tapes playing in our head, you know? So we still hosted, we had the board over into our home. We had the confirmation class over for pizza or lasagna or whatever it was at the beginning of each year. When I was working and I was commuting from Westchester County by train into Manhattan, I remember getting out as early as I could. I worked for a Jewish organization, so we shut down pretty early on Friday. I'd get the train home after working all week, and somehow, I never could do it now, but somehow made a dinner for the scholar in residence who was, I mean, in our home, okay, that kind of, and so we were doing both. That's what happened to a lot of us. And I also want to mention our own experience with the chaplaincy, which was, you know, Jim became a chaplain. He was ordained in 1967, and that's when the draft was heating up. There was the Vietnam War was building up. And everyone in his class, and maybe the class before and the class after, who were physically fit were required, actually, to take the test and go into the military. We had no idea what to expect from that, but it turned out to be our first congregation, and both in Travis Air Force Base in California, and then in Turkey. We were sent to Turkey the second year, which turned out to be most amazing 2 years. I mean, we look back on it, we still have friends from those years. It opened up our eyes to a world that we just didn't know, especially living abroad. But both our children were born when we were in the Air Force, and the other parents of young children, they were our mentors. So, I mean, I found that parallel for other spouses who did go into the military, and there were others who had who were abroad, and that was a whole unique experience. I also, you know, I want to mention, since Naomi brought up the Rebbitzin thing, and I know that's one of the questions that Rabbi Miller said he hoped to ask us about, that, you know, there were also positive role models of being a Rebbitzin. Throughout this book, you'll find people either embraced it, and I think a lot of it has to do with the name and that image that Naomi described of a dowdy woman. But I had an image when Jim was an assistant rabbi. at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York. Ed Klein was the senior rabbi, and his wife was Ruth, who was dignified and clearly loving the congregants. And I watched her, and that's how I learned to work the room at an Oneg Shabbat, for instance, or whatever. There were really other positive role models of Rebbitzin, whether people call themselves that or not. So I would say, to your question, what I learned about the other spouses is that basically the most important thing that came through was their support of their spouse, their usually husband, and also how they felt supported. I guess anybody's going to write an essay for a book like this is going to be fairly centered and not, and not talking wild thoughts. So I think everybody felt it was a huge time of transition that we were going through, and we were going through it together with our spouse, and we were learning together as we went along.
Thank you, Jane. And I appreciate all those pieces of really sharing with us the connections that you felt to your fellow authors throughout this process. We're going to keep asking some more questions. I'd also let those who are joining us on Zoom know that you're able to ask other questions. We're going to have a Q&A session later. If you want to send those to me in the chat, you can do that, and I will be happy to pose some of those questions to our guests a little bit later. But right now, I'd like to hear from both of you, whoever would like to go first. Another question about the book itself. Was there one entry that stood out for you from those that you read in the book?
Why don't I start? Because I read all the entries many times, but it was only recently, actually, when I was preparing for this program and one that I am doing at my own synagogue, and a program that is being done in Atlanta, that I sat down. I said, you know what? I'd better reread the book. And what happened was I sat and I read the book, and it was actually the first time I had ever read it, because I read the pieces as they came in. I edited them. I re-edited them. But I had never read them consecutively, as a book. And first, I have to say I was very impressed. It's an interesting group of people and a wide variety of things that they have to say and did. And I wish that I had known a lot of these things much earlier. It might have affected the way I served as a rabbi spouse, both what I did, what I didn't do, what I might have done. It was fascinating. There are, again, I've lost your question. But
you're asking what stood out for you? Is there one that, you're on the right path.
Okay, good. There were a number of essays by women who were rabbis' wives, who were Rebbitzins in the South during the Civil Rights era, and had some very extraordinary, powerful, and in many cases unnerving experiences. Those were remarkable to read. There was another woman who died quite young, who knew that she was very ill, and who wrote essentially an ethical will for her children. And her surviving husband allowed me to go through it and edit it down for purposes of the essay for the book. That was very, very, very powerful. Not only reading it, but the things that she had to say. Then there were, other things. Someone who had major problems because of congregants who were unhappy with what she was doing in the workforce, that she wasn't, that she wasn't at home being 100% of her time as the rabbi's spouse. There are funny things that people wrote. It's a whole broad range. Jane, do you have specific ones?
Well, when Adam sent the question a little bit earlier today, I thought it's really hard to single out any of them. I hope that some of you will read some of these essays, because they are remarkable women. That's, after reading the whole thing, I came away with that sense that these are really it's worth knowing these people. It's a moment in history, but it's also a wonderful story of women. of a certain generation. Naomi mentioned civil rights. There was one story that jumped out at me, and there were actually a few people who wrote about this. There was during the concern for civil rights, one woman who lived in Atlanta, her husband was the rabbi during the bombing of the synagogue in Atlanta, and she remembers him getting the call early in the morning and rushing out. And then a little while later, she got a phone call saying there's a bomb under your house. And it's going to go off in 5 minutes. And she believed it was a hoax, but you don't take chances with that. I mean, I think that, living with that kind of fear and the involvement and the passion for, the passion that comes out in a lot of these stories for different parts of Jewish life. I mean, so many of these women did end up in, also in Jewish profession, became Jewish professionals of one kind or another. Federation directors, and one was. So it's really hard to single that out. I hope that you have the opportunity. There is, I know, one copy in the Temple Library, and Naomi reminds me that it's available, Married to the Rabbi is available on Amazon, and the Kindle edition is very, very reasonable. So just a plug for Married to the Rabbi right there. I think you'll get a kick out of it. I'd like to also respond with one story. There are just all scattered through the book. Some only wrote some of the anecdotes of the challenges that they were facing, but those that faced it with spouses who had a sense of humor, or if they had a sense of humor, they ended up in a much better place. So there's one story. You read the book and you can find out who it is, and if you know her. She was in New York, and there one of the pains was a congregant who just would talk and talk and talk and talk at the Oneg Shabbat, grab you and not let you get away when even if other people were waiting, but just talk and talk and talk. And she said, this person also made phone calls to their home and talked and talked and talked and talked. And one day her husband was out at a meeting and she got a call from this woman, and she listened, and she was polite, and she listened, and the woman talked and she listened, and she said she got to a point where smoke was coming out of her ears, and she grabbed a scissors that was right by the telephone. Remember, those were the days when we had telephones with cords, and she cut the cord. And her husband came home, and she explained what had happened, and the two of them laughed and laughed and laughed, and she said they're still laughing. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotes in this book that will make you chuckle, so it's another good reason to read it. You may see yourself on the end, but I don't think most of you will, because you're all just the best.
Thank you, Jane, for that amusing anecdote. Naomi, I want to go back to something you brought up earlier about the single male partner who was in this book. Can you share with us his story?
Yes, I can, and I actually just give me 1 second. If I can find it quickly. This was a second marriage. Okay, here. He very succinctly captured in his essay the difference between Rebbitzins and male spouses of rabbis, and pretty much why nobody has bothered to come up with a male equivalent for the word Rebbitzin. He was speaking about a group of youngish male he was speaking with a group of youngish male spouses he met at the Star Convention. That's the rabbinic convention, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the annual convention. He said that all of them were working full-time except for one man who had taken time off to take care of their children. None of them, and I'm going to quote because I'd rather use his words. None of them had felt pressure to attend services, serve on committees, join the men's club, or participate in any way that didn't meet their own personal interests. Our conclusion, he said, was that the members of each congregation viewed us as professionals who were married to rabbis, but never thought that they were getting 2 for 1 to serve the congregation. Because there were no demands on them, he said, we were all comfortable with our position and there was nothing further to discuss. Which I can tell you from, and you can tell, I will plug the book also, you can tell from many of the essays, it's not the case for rabbis' wives. There were lots of expectations, both from the congregation and internally imposed, as Jane mentioned also. It's much easier. You know, it's totally different now. Also, I assume for all rabbis' wives because of the presence of so many female rabbis. The field has changed. The expectations have changed. If that answers, I wanted to respond to something that Jane said. Well, does that?
Go ahead.
Can I go on?
Sure.
Okay. There were a couple of things. First of all, there is an anecdote which is in the book that I had heard from this woman herself, the rabbi's wife in Atlanta, when the night of the bombing, they'd been up very late and there was a lot of aggravation. The phone rang and the phone was on her side of the bed. And she picked up the phone and it was a reporter from New York. And she said, I can't, my husband is sleeping. Excuse me, she did not say that. I just blew the story. The rabbi is sleeping. I can't let you talk to him now. And finally, she awakened him. He said, give me the phone. And he picked up the phone. And the first thing that the reporter asked was that your wife I was talking to? At which point he said, if it was my wife, was not my wife, do you think I would have told you? So that was another story. I don't know that I mentioned when I said the kinds of fields that rabbis' wives have been in, is that one of the women who wrote is a retired accountant. And she discovered fairly late on that accountants, she was the only female accountant in the congregation. The male accountants and their families were sure she was competing with them. And because she had lunch with her colleagues who were men, there were all kinds of terrible rumors about her having affairs with her colleagues. So this is, which is one of the things that shows up in the book, a whole range of joy and upset and aggravation. But I would say that the majority of writers consciously said how happy they were to have married a rabbi, to have been involved in rabbinic life, and the perks, the good things that came, the unexpected perks, because of the honor and what's the right word I'm thinking of? Appreciation given to the rabbi, extended to their families. I can say from myself, I am a writer, and I have written. Well, in recent years, I wrote the prayer book for our congregation, but I would write a second day Rosh Hashanah service and various other things. Nobody, who was going to look at it and decide whether it was possible to be used or not. It was, it didn't have to be critiqued or criticized. And that was the case, in many rabbi spouses in all of their fields. And I suspect it was the same thing with teaching too, with teaching in the congregation and even serving as the principal some of the time, because it's very hard. If the congregation likes the rabbi, then they are on eggshells with the rabbi's spouse, which is, I guess, I don't know what your experience is in your congregation, but certainly in our congregation in New Jersey, there came a time when when congregants were not hired to be principal of the religious school because of the potential conflict it could create. And the same is or isn't or was or wasn't true with rabbi spouses. And some of that comes up in the book as well.
Thank you, Naomi. You both have alluded to the fact that there's a different generation now. The American rabbinate has evolved over the years, and so has the experience of rabbinic partners. From your perspectives, each of you, what do you think differentiates the experiences of today's rabbinic spouses? And one of the questions that came in is wondering, for each of you, Jane and Naomi, if one of your grandchildren told you that they were going to be marrying a rabbi, what would your reaction be, and what advice would you give them? Jane, you want to start us off?
That's a good question. Well, I'd certainly be thrilled if any of my grandchildren decided that they wanted to work in any way in the Jewish community. And I'm very proud of all of them right now, because even though they're teenagers or about to be teenagers, they're involved with Jewish life right now. So the first part of your question was what?
Generationally, how has the role evolved?
Right. Certainly, expectations have changed for all women. I mean, it's cultural. It's across the board. So spouses of rabbis, they have way more options, although there's still, women's lib came, and we know that still equal pay is not a given, but the options are much, much more open for spouses of any professional. But I think that's certainly true for rabbinic spouses, to be whatever they want to be. I think I want to just mention another issue that came up in the book in a few places, and how we dealt with it. There were two things about, people talked about living in a fishbowl. Some talked about, they thought there were expectations for their children to be more perfect because they were the children of rabbis. I asked my own kids before doing this what they remembered from that time. And I was very pleased when, both of them said, but our daughter said very clearly, well, it's the way you handled it, Mom. Yeah, I suppose there were expectations, but you treated us just like regular kids, and that's what your expectations were of us, and so we never had a problem with it. And I think that you can't really judge other people. There may have been kids who were picked on or bullied or whatever. I never saw that happen, but I think it's possible. And then the living in a fishbowl thing, it's what you make of it, right? Every profession, certainly politicians have it. They're followed by paparazzi and so on. We were never followed by paparazzi, but we were, we were out there. And as Naomi mentioned, it provided a lot of benefits. I think one of the biggest benefits, and many of the spouses mentioned that, was that we were able to be helpful. I mean, it's we talk about tikkun olam, a very important value of repairing the world. We had an opportunity when we were in the Air Force. Jim and I were barely older than the single airmen who worked for him, but we became like their parents. They came over to our house, and we invited them for Shabbat dinner. And when sometimes people have problems that they express to a spouse, and you have an opportunity to be helpful, although usually I would always say, it'd really be important for you to tell this to the rabbi. But we had lots of opportunities to be helpful and help build a better world through Judaism. I mean, that I can't separate that from myself. That's who I am. I'm very grateful for that, and I think that comes through in this book for the most part. There are a few people. There's one person that I felt very sad for, who said, except for going to her children's wedding, she never set foot in a synagogue. This was in South Africa, and there were lots of other problems. Anyway, and so those are things that are surprising. But running through was the story about valuing Judaism, about the rabbi's support for a Jewish family life, about the spouse's support for what the rabbi was doing. Because without that, it's hard to have a successful marriage. It's hard to have a successful life. So I'm definitely grateful for those wonderful opportunities.
Wonderful. Naomi, I would first start with you with the question of, what would you tell your grandchildren whether they say they were going to marry a rabbi? And then we've also gotten a couple of questions for you about whether any of the spouses decided to go back to rabbinical school themselves, or if you talked with any rabbi, or rabbi cantor clergy couples as part of this project.
The short answer in terms of women who went back to school, the answer is yes. One who wrote for us. In terms of the project, we did not really contact individuals and say, do please write an essay. We sent out general invitations, and those who responded were the ones who responded. So I don't know if that answers that particular question, but let me see. I probably lost you. I lost my train of thought. So come back and give me, please.
Well, what would you, if one of your grandchildren came to you today and asked about marrying a clergy member, what would your response be?
Well, you know what? It's a different time from ours. We are retired. we are in a different generation. I would possibly, but depend. I would possibly ask them, why aren't you choosing to go to rabbinical school yourself, depending on what field, they're all girls, what field she is in. It's, the rabbinate has been, for me, I can really speak only for myself, but having read all of these essays, to a certain extent for the others, it's been a wonderful experience. The opportunities to meet people, to be involved with people, to get to know people's lives in ways that they open themselves up. How shall I describe this? It's, they let their guards down, and it's been a privilege and a responsibility. So, I don't know whether I would encourage my granddaughters. My daughters are old. I mean, relatively speaking, if I would encourage my granddaughters to want to be rabbis, I wouldn't object either if they married rabbis or chose to be rabbis. But it's the rabbinate's a mixed bag. It's a lot of expectations, a lot of time commitments, a lot of being responsible to and for people, and also a very wonderful experience. I mean, I don't think that we would change it. I don't think my husband and I would change it. Maybe individual things here and there, but in general, it's been a great run, which obviously I hope continues at least a little bit longer.
And just to clarify, going back for a moment, the question came back just to clarify. You said one person went back to school. Did she become a rabbi as well?
And full.
It was. Yes.
She was married to a rabbi. Her husband died, and she had always really wanted to be a rabbi. And and then when he died, she went to rabbinical school and became a rabbi.
Thank you. I blanked on the question.
Thank you. That was a very common question, people wanting to know the connection. I appreciate the two of you coming in and taking this time to share your stories and highlight this material for us. I want to thank Susan Pittleman, Robin Mintz, and Rabbi Boxman, who helped put this together. They've been organizing our Between the Lines series, earlier with Stars of David, now this project, and there's more yet to come. So we are grateful to the three of them for this wonderful work. Jane, as a closing piece as we get towards the end, what would you like readers to take away from this collection?
Well, I think what I took away from reading this collection, just recently reading them all cover to cover, is that, first of all, rabbis are wonderful. And I want to do a shout out to Jim and to Norman and to you, Rabbi Miller, because I think there's no one who knows as much as we spouses do how hard the job is and how devoted the rabbi has to be to Jewish life and to this calling. It really is a calling. And I think that comes out in the book. I think I would want to remind people that there are different paths to leading a very wonderful, committed Jewish life. And if you have children or grandchildren, so many of us were inspired by Jewish camping, by youth groups, by trips to Israel. We didn't say much about Israel, but it's all through the book. There were people who went and actually made Aliyah. The love of Israel and Zionism is there in the book, and it comes out. So that if you can do whatever you can to encourage your grandchildren to go to Jewish camps when the pandemic is over, go on trips to Israel with them, or send them. Because what emerges here, I mean, you probably would say, oh well, I would expect that they're they're living lives devoted to rabbis and to Judaism, but it wasn't a given for all of them in the beginning who didn't have that strong Jewish background, but most of them did some exploration on their own. So many of them, whether they had the background or not, became teachers in the religious school, learned on their own. It's just, I think it's very uplifting to read these essays and know that, Judaism is strong and alive because of rabbis, and also because of rabbi spouses who probably didn't get as much credit as they should have, but deserve it.
Thank you, Jane.
Amen.
Naomi, do you have any final words, or we end with Jane's?
Well, I was going to say amen to Jane's comments.
A beautiful way.
Rabbi spouses.
This has been a wonderful experience, and I'm so glad that you shared these stories, and for all of these stories to be shared. When you read the book, in the foreword, there's a reference made to the remarkable series by the New York Times of Overlooked, the obituaries of many people from history who were overlooked because they weren't the people in power at the time. Many of them were not white males. And as you think about the series that they've been doing of these different obituaries, many of which are women who were overlooked because they were not the men of the time, this speaks to that. Being able to hear these stories from the women who were right there beside the rabbi of the congregation, who are heart and soul of the congregation, and who are really there caring so deeply about the Jewish community in which they live. So thank you both for bringing to light these overlooked stories. Thank you to everyone who has been joining us today.